I guess to what extent should Americans feel some level of confidence? Of course, we have that bipartisan deal and it's expected to be voted later today, but does this really turn a chapter in Washington politics? And if not, how do we get there?
It remains to be seen, frankly. I mean, I describe this as a baby step because essentially that's what it is in the context of the overarching issues with respect to the budget, the level of debt, the inability to address a debt and entitlement reform, and as well as tax reform and regulatory reform that are so essential to reviving the economic conditions that, would galvanize the private sector to invest in jobs and capital equipment. So it remains to be seen. I think that that's, again, reflective in the polls in the sense that the public doesn't have the confidence in their elected officials and in the governing institutions, because there hasn't been anything to demonstrate that. This is a glimmer of hope, and I think as it unfolds in the weeks and months ahead, will determine whether or not they have turned the corner and put the past behind them with respect to the dysfunction that has really impeded their ability to do the things that are necessary in the best interests of this country.
Now, it's been cited that you left Washington because of the gridlock and what's been going on for the past several years. What do politicians need to do? What do they need to do? What do the American people need to do to tell politicians, hey, this is a problem and we can't have any more of this? Because it's been going on for quite some time now.
It has, and I think that's sort of the conclusion that I came to, is that how do you change it? And that obviously has to occur from the outside and the public pressure. Frankly, I'm encouraging people to weigh in using social media, online technology, communicating with their elected officials and imparting their views and positions, because obviously those that have been on the extremes or the more polarizing groups have certainly weighed in. That obviously has resulted in the kind of turmoil that's existed in Congress for far too long, and to the detriment of the country and its future. So the public can play a pivotal role, and I want to encourage that, because I think so often people underestimate their voice and the impact that they can have by communicating their views. But if the elected officials don't hear from the public, then they're not going to react, and they'll react to those who they hear from. And that was certainly evident in an article that appeared in Politico newspaper right after the shutdown, and it said that there were a number of pre-shutdown assumptions, one of which would be a public backlash against the shutdown towards lawmakers, and that didn't happen. It surprised the elected officials that there wasn't this public outcry, according to the story. So again, I think that underscores the importance of communication, and also not only just weighing in the election, because I think that's obviously paramount, and insisting and valuing bipartisanship and consensus, and demanding to know from the candidates or those who are running for re-election, what are you going to do to contribute to making the government work and working across the political aisle, because there's no other way if you're going to develop solutions for the problems facing this country. And so to insist on it at that point, political rewards for those who are willing to work across the aisle, and a penalty for those who don't. But even in the interim, during the course of the term, is to weigh in real time. And that's, again, using the social media, the online technology that is so essential and effective. And obviously, that's what others did. The forces of division, certainly united and well organized and well funded. And so that's why the public can play a pivotal role in being the offset and a counterweight to those voices and to those forces of division.
But we have those extreme voices on either end. It seems like there's this silent, moderate majority somewhere in the middle. And then during the campaign process, we have primaries, and it's those extreme views that typically win out in the end. How do we, I guess, find that middle ground again? You
Right.
mentioned some of the process here,
Yeah.
but the realities are quite
Right,
different.
because what's happened is the focus has become now almost solely concentrated on the primaries. And, in the past, at some point, you'd have more center-right, center-left candidates that would emerge from the primaries, and then would try to appeal to a broader electorate in the fall. But now you're having the more, far-right and far-left candidates emerging from the primary, and they can overlook the general population in the fall. And the general population doesn't have the choices that ordinarily would be available to support in the current climate. So what has to change is, in my opinion, is developing independent redistricting commissions in as many states as possible, frankly. There are a dozen states approximately that have already put independent redistricting commissions in place. And then secondly, have more open primaries. There are various forms of open primaries, but nevertheless is allowing independents to vote in a primary, and that can mitigate the ideological forces in these primaries, or those are the ones who are solely voting in these primaries, or the far right, and not having more centrist candidates who can survive primaries. So it gives more competition to the candidacies. So if you don't have to change all states, but if you change enough states, it can change the equilibrium and the balance. And that's what's important, because you don't have that competition, within these primaries, and then ultimately, the elected officials are, basically representing homogeneous and politically homogeneous congressional districts, and even in the United States Senate, they represent more solidified constituencies. They're more fearful of a primary than they are about the general election. That's true, on both sides and actually in both chambers. So that's why you get the more narrowly tailored positions, developing in the chambers, on any of the issues that come before the House or the Senate.
I was going to ask, government democracy works best when everyone has a seat at the table and can express their voice. But when you have groups of people who aren't interested in politics, or maybe young people who don't want to be involved, how do you bring those people to the table, and how do you, sort to turn the tide with people who just don't care?
Yeah, that's concerning, and I've been on many college campuses across the country, and I'm encouraging young people, and we're working in the Bipartisan Policy Center as well with groups on campuses, in addition to other efforts involving young people, because it's about their future, and we have to get them involved. And I can understand why the current climate would not exactly be attractive. And I've heard that from a number of young people, who are interested in public service, or interested in making a public contribution, but they don't view public office as one element, as a way of contributing. That's not the best way that they feel that they could contribute because of the dysfunction. And I said, only they can change it. As young people, engaged in the process, they can make a difference because it's about their future as well as the country's. And so it is important for them to engage, and that they can make a difference. One person can make a difference. And I started out, at a young age as well in the political arena. Of course, it was a different political climate. And oftentimes young people ask me, well, you left, so now you left politics, so why are you asking us to join us? It's a very good question, actually. And I said, because I'm at the other stage in life, having been in the legislative branch for 40 years, 34 in the House and Senate. So I felt that the best way I could contribute was outside the institution, given the dynamic internally, that it wasn't going to change from the inside. So I wanted to, use my knowledge and experience on the outside to make that contribution. I thought that was the best way at this stage of life. If I was at the beginning, I would be right there, because you want to be in the arena, you want to be fighting and competing, for the best ideas and figuring out how to solve problems, but that's not the kind of environment that exists today. So I want to change that so we can get back to the way it should be in solving problems and what's best for the country, and looking at the country as a whole is so essential. So I'm encouraging them, and I've had a lot of interesting conversations, with so many young people, because I'm very impressed by the people I have met on campuses, because they are interested in the world around them, and they're just trying to figure out what's the best avenue to pursue. And I just want to encourage them at some point in life to engage in running for public office and serving, because you really can make an impact. And if they're in there, they can change it. And hopefully we can get it changed before then. And the American people are certainly, sounding the alarm bells about what's transpiring. And that contributed, frankly, to the agreement that was reached yesterday.
You mentioned the arena
Mm-hmm.
and serving the public.
Yes.
Within this arena where you have served for many years,
Mhm.
male-dominated for the most
Right.
part, how much of it is serving the public? How much of it is serving lobbyists? How much of it is self-serving the ego? I mean, what do you see among the politicians you've dealt with in the past? Because it seems like you're always campaigning for the next
Mhm.
campaign, the next election. So,
Well, no, it's about solving problems. I mean, you have to concentrate. Obviously, you have an election and you want to be prepared for that. But historically, at least from my experience, is that the first year after an election, Congress generally concentrated on the issues that, were important to the country. It had a legislative agenda that synchronized between the president and the Congress in some fashion. Obviously, they have differences of opinion, but ultimately moved ahead and forged solutions to the key issues, recognizing which ones were paramount to address. And that's what has not happened in recent years. That's what's dramatically changed. The process has changed internally in the Congress, where you don't have the rank and file weighing in and participating and amending and considering legislation. It's all been locked down, developed behind closed doors, and you have these deals that are made that without transparency and ultimately leads to poor public policy. It's always in the 11th hour, in a state of crisis. I always, describe it as the high noon at the OK Corral moment, because they just got to set them up and tee them up for the base. And that's what's changed dramatically. Yes, obviously you have to focus on your reelection, but, I was a big advocate for campaign finance reform, because I think there's just far too much money in these elections. You have to raise too much money to survive, and also to face the onslaught of ads from outside groups. And so it's very difficult to anticipate how much money is going to be spent, against you, because generally they're not for you. And ultimately, it ratchets up the amount of money in these campaigns. And unfortunately, it was my initiative that was in the McCain-Feingold that was struck down in Citizens United. I was trying to get at the heart of the issue ads that were being run before elections, and that they should be more accountable and be, like political action committees, so that they can only give, limited dollars and so on. But ultimately, it unleashed the forces of the super PACs. And that's, so campaign finance is crucial. And how we address the central question now remains to be seen, short of a constitutional amendment. That's a long road. So you have to find other avenues, and I'm talking to people as well, and we're talking, it's bipartisan policies, and it may well be a recommendation if we can figure out a way that can withstand any constitutional challenges, but can get at some of the sources of the problems that exist within these campaigns. It is disturbing to the level of which the amounts of money that are now being used in the campaigns. I mean, it's grown exponentially over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I guess, if you're at the lowest of lows, there's only nowhere to go but up. Is this an exciting time for people to get into politics, to be in Washington? Because, as you say, there is the potential to bring about great change.
That's exactly right. And that's why I'm encouraging young people and others to get involved in this process, because it can make a difference. It can have a profound impact in changing the political dynamic the hyper-partisanship and the all-or-nothing propositions that continue to, constrain their ability, to solve problems. I always believed that the essence of public service was solving problems and contributing to the greater good. Ultimately, you can have your differences. I don't think that, it's understood that you can have your political differences, and certainly even in an election year might be more challenging to push through a legislative agenda. But, I think that's what the process is all about. It's healthy to have, strong debates and listen to competing ideas, but at the end of the day, it was always about advancing the goal and solving the problems facing the country. And that is the missing ingredient. It's lost, sight. They've lost sight of the purpose of public service in their key objective. It's about what is the greater good for the country, and that's what's dramatically changed in the political landscape.
The session calendar, the calendar has changed as far as how much time is spent in Washington. You mentioned redistricting and finance and all these things, but how much has changing that calendar changed the dynamics of getting things done?
No, that's changed remarkably in a way that is very difficult to understand. In fact, I noticed that in my last 2 years, and I argued how we should cancel a few recesses and spend our time focusing on the problems like the debt ceiling at the time, for example, or the expiring, tax cuts that became part of the fiscal cliff crisis at the end of the last Congress, sort of bookended that Congress between the debt ceiling and the fiscal cliff crisis. And the Congress doesn't spend that much time in Washington. I argued for 5-day work weeks, frankly. It sounds very basic, but it's very important, because if Congress isn't there for a full 5-day work week, it's very challenging to focus on the complex, intricate issues that are facing Congress today. Whether you're dealing with tax reform or entitlement reform or debt reductions or passing a budget, which, that's escaped Congress over the last few years. It's 3 consecutive years without a budget, and even this year without a budget. They reached this agreement ultimately as of yesterday, but the deadline was April 15th, and then all the appropriation bills that weren't passed to fund the operations of government. So 5-day work week would have a pronounced impact, and I understand the value of going home. I went home all the time. I thought it was important to connect with your constituency. But you could have 3 weeks where you have 5-day work week, and then a week, where you can be in your district or your state, balancing it out. But I always felt that one thing was predictable about Congress, which was the recesses. And in fact, it's the first 6 months in 2011, when we had the uncertainty about the debt ceiling. Between January and June, according to the Congressional Research Service, the United States Senate was out, half of its time was non-legislative activity, giving speeches, not on legislation, just in general, or in quorum calls, but nothing, so half the time. So it just, I think, illustrates the point that we have to have a more practical work schedule, and they have to be synchronized between the House and Senate. Another thing that's sort of evolved over the last few years is that the House and Senate will have different recess schedules, so you can't synchronize the work of both chambers. In the past, it generally has been synchronized because it makes sense. So you're working in lockstep on the issues to make sure they're getting done. But if members aren't around to work in the committees on these key issues, then they can't focus on the facts and what matters, what doesn't matter, and how you're going to work through your differences. And perhaps they'll get to know one another and reacquaint themselves with their colleagues and understand, what is the frame of reference, a vantage point for each, of their colleagues who serve on a respective committee. But even the committees, certainly in the Senate, my last few years, were virtually not doing any work because it was all now concentrated in the hands of leadership to design something to vote on, on an up or down basis, which was not consistent with the tradition practices of the Senate. We ought to go back to the regular order of business, start on the committee process. I have always said I threatened to go to the floor and have a refresher course on how a bill becomes law. In Schoolhouse Rocks, put the bill in the hopper and, go to the committee, because, you work it out. That's the other thing about work, you have to work out these issues and you sort through the differences in the committee. You have those debates, you have those amendments, it yields a good product. And if you do it on a bipartisan basis, you get some very effective ideas. It's going to make it a more workable solution. If you look at Affordable Care Act, there was no bipartisan buy-in at the end, and I was very extensively involved in that issue. But it's so, it's regrettable because that they didn't start, ultimately bring in, Republicans and work on a bipartisan basis at, when it was clear that Republicans would not be able to support it. And I said at the outset, and I think the Finance Committee chair did an excellent job. He set the template for bipartisan approach. But unfortunately, the wheels came off the process, I said, when it left Finance Committee, went behind closed doors. But you have to do that, and you see that illustrated, I think, with the Affordable Care Act. Unlike Social Security and Medicare, when they were passed with overwhelmingly bipartisan margins.